Hi guys, Dr. E here with a review of Chapter 13. Chapter 13 talks about the endocrine system, so we're going to be talking about hormones and their actions. First off, we need to figure out what is the chemistry of these different hormones. So we have two different kinds of hormones. They're both organic compounds, meaning they've got huge amounts of carbon and hydrogen. They're either made out of cholesterol, so they're steroid hormones, or made out of protein, and those are non-steroid hormones. So the steroid hormones, as I said, they're mainly made out of cholesterol. So for example, we've got sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. We also have the hormones that come out of the adrenal cortex like cortisol and aldosterone. As for the non-steroid, or the old name was protein hormones, as you can see from the name, they're made out of amino acids. If it's made out of just a couple of amino acids, so they're going to call them amines, like for example epinephrine or norepinephrine. If it's a short chain of amino acids like oxytocin is, we're going to call it a peptide hormone. If it's made out of a very long chain of amino acid like growth hormone, we're calling that protein. If you add a little carb to it, that is a glycoprotein hormone, for example TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Here you can see a table that shows you the type of compound, what is the chemical composition of it, and these little examples that we're going to kind of talk about them as we go. Here's a molecular formula showing you the structural formulas of hormones. So that right here is a very long chain of amino acid that represents a protein hormone. You can see here these rings of cholesterol that we've added different things to. So for example here norepinephrine as well, you can see that ring with other things added to it. So these are example of steroid hormones. So why do we need hormones? Well, these hormones are there because they change the metabolic processes. So they could have an effect on the enzymes. They can either slow them down or make them go faster. They can also change how things go in and out of the cell, so they alter the rate of membrane transport of a substance. And in order for a hormone to act, it has to attach to a target. It figures out its target cell by the receptor. The target cell will have a receptor that is specific to that hormone. That receptor could either be on the cell membrane from the outside or inside of the nucleus on the inside, and we'll talk about which one is, when do we use either one of these receptors. The cell also has the ability to upregulate or downregulate the number of receptors it has. So if there is just way too much of the hormone circulating in the bloodstream, the cells get overwhelmed with all that hormone. The cell is able to downregulate the number of receptors that it has. And the opposite is true as well. If there isn't enough hormone circulating in the bloodstream, the cell, in order to capture and attach to as much hormone as it can, it is going to upregulate the number of receptors. So first off, we'll talk about the mechanism of action of steroid and thyroid hormones. So remember, steroid and steroid-like hormones are made out of cholesterol, which is basically fat. So they are dissolvable in fat. Okay, you can dissolve them in oil. Remember, the bilayer of phospholipids of the cell membrane is basically a lot of fat. So it does have the ability to cross through very easily the cell membrane. On the other hand, it is very poor water soluble because, again, it's basically made out of fat. So I'm going to take you to this next slide to kind of see a picture of what we're talking about. So that is your steroid hormone in the bloodstream, or in the extracellular fluid actually, and that right here is the cell membrane. This represents your cytoplasm. This represents the nucleus, and you can see here these nuclear membranes. So what is going on here? The hormone, the steroid hormone again, is not very water soluble, but it is lipid soluble, so it has the ability to cross the cell membrane very easily. It goes in through the nuclear pore and attaches to the receptor inside of the nucleus. So a steroid and thyroid hormones, those have nuclear receptors. Now that nuclear receptor is going to activate a whole process. Hopefully you guys are familiar at this point with this image right here of protein synthesis. So again, steroid hormones attach to these nuclear receptors and they activate the whole process of protein synthesis. This takes a little bit of time, so when we try to compare steroid to non-steroid hormones, the whole process of making a protein, you've got the transcription, you've got translation, that it takes a little bit of time in order to happen. So the effect of steroid hormones, the onset takes a little bit of time in order for the steroid hormone to show its effect. Now for the non-steroid hormones, these again are made out of basically protein, and protein is water soluble, so it has no problem, going through the plasma and the extracellular fluid, but it does have a problem crossing the cell membrane, so it is not lipid soluble. It has to attach to a receptor on the surface of the cell membrane, so it has a surface receptor. So here you can see that non-steroid hormone molecule, and you can see the receptor is on the surface of the cell membrane. Again, because it's made out of protein, basically, it cannot cross the cell membrane. It'll have to attach to that receptor, to that surface receptor. When it attaches to the surface receptor, it is going to activate a whole other system within the cell known as a cyclic AMP. Now, cyclic AMP needs energy. Okay, so we're going to use some ATP, and we are going to activate a protein kinase. So you can see here that it leads to different changes inside of the cell, and with the activation of different enzymes on the inside of the cell. So it's kind of like we have two different messengers. We have the first messenger out here, that is your non-steroid hormone, while the second messenger here is the cyclic AMP that leads to the activation of the protein kinase. Okay. Now for the control of hormonal secretion. So just like anything else in the body, we have to control, the body has to control itself. So it does that through negative feedback mechanisms, where if you need a hormone, it comes out, and as soon as it does its effect, the body will downregulate, again, the amount of hormone coming out. Hormones are usually very short-lived. Some, kind of vary from a few minutes to a few days. The hormones are mainly excreted in urine. Okay, and they are broken down by different enzymes. Most of these enzymes are found in the liver, and that is why if somebody has liver failure, you are going to find that they have lots of hormonal imbalance because they've lost that ability to break down these hormones. Now for the control, how to control these different hormones. Most hormones are controlled by negative feedback. We do have, kind of like maybe one exception, which is a positive feedback, and that is during labor. So when oxytocin comes, and that is the hormone that contracts the uterus, as long as the baby is, or the fetus is still in the utero, oxytocin is going to keep on being released by positive feedback until the fetus is expelled out of the uterus. So that is really your example of positive feedback, where instead of stopping the secretion of the hormone, because we already have enough in the bloodstream, that doesn't happen in this case, but we have to keep on pushing with more and more oxytocin until we reach the final goal of delivery of that fetus. But most of, basically the rest of our hormones are controlled through negative feedback. We have three different kinds of feedback. We've got tropic hormones, okay, and those are hormones that come from one gland, and they basically control the secretion from another gland. There's also a control of the nervous system, so the nervous system does control how much hormones we make. And then there's a change in the internal environment, so kind of depending on the amount of glucose in bloodstream, do I need more insulin or not? Or the amount of sodium or potassium in the bloodstream, do I need aldosterone or do I not need aldosterone, and so on. So these are your three methods in which negative feedback really controls the hormonal secretion. So here you can see in this image, you can see the three methods that we talked about. So the tropic hormones, we have hormones that come out of the hypothalamus, and those control release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary hormones are going to, in turn, control the release of hormones from the peripheral glands. And so I'll give you an example. So for example, the hypothalamus is going to make what is known as the TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. So the TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone, released by the hypothalamus will reach through the bloodstream, not the bloodstream, but through the an axis. It is going to reach the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary gland is going to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Now TSH through the bloodstream is going to reach the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland releases thyroxine. Thyroxine reaches your target cell, say your liver cell, and then it'll lead to its action. Okay. Your second mechanism would be the nervous system. So the nervous system is able to send impulses to different endocrine glands, like for example the adrenal cortex, to release more adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those are released and again go to the target cell and lead to different actions. So for example, if you are in a stressful situation, the hypothalamus will release a nervous signal to the adrenal medulla to make epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those through the bloodstream will reach, let's say, your heart. So that would be your target cell in this case, and the action would be tachycardia. So the heart would beat a little bit faster. When that happens, then by negative feedback, will inhibit the hypothalamus from making too much epinephrine and norepinephrine, or from releasing that from the adrenal medulla. The third mechanism would be changes in the internal environment. So we talked about the levels of glucose. So let's say you just ate a meal and levels of glucose are very high now in the bloodstream. So that will stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin will go to all of the cells in the body. Insulin is going to be basically absorbed into all of these cells. That leads to a drop in insulin levels in the bloodstream. Now that action by negative feedback will inhibit the pancreas from making more insulin. So negative feedback, so again, hormonal secretion, we kind of already talked about this. But if you have, if this is where your normal hormone levels are, if there's a stimulus, so I'm going to take really the example of glucose and insulin. So if the insulin is too high, so if the hormone levels are too high, that is going to be felt by the receptors throughout the body, and that would inhibit the endocrine gland from making more of that hormone. So by negative feedback, we went back to our normal hormone levels. It also goes, that same story goes when the hormone levels are too low. So if the hormone levels are too low, that is picked up by the receptors, and that will stimulate the gland to make more of the hormone in response to that, so in order to reach a normal hormone level. Here we can see the negative feedback. We really do not have a constant level of hormone throughout the day. It is more of kind of, as you can see here, kind of a cycle where there is an average normal, but the actual concentration of hormone kind of varies and throughout the day. So it fluctuates, as you see, around your average. Now we'll talk first about the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is one of the glands that is in the brain. It is found in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, which is that little dip that you find in the sphenoid bone. It is made out of two lobes. The one in the front is known as the anterior lobe, or the adenohypophysis. The one in the back is known as the posterior lobe, or the neurohypophysis. The anterior lobe, or the adeno. Adeno means gland, so the anterior lobe is really an actual gland. The posterior lobe, though, known as the neurohypophysis again, is really not a gland. It's not made out of glandular tissue. It's made out of nervous tissue. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by a pituitary stalk, also known as the infundibulum. So here you can see the pituitary gland inside of the sella turcica, found in the sphenoid bone. That's your anterior lobe. That is the posterior lobe. And you can see here that connection between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus above it through that infundibulum. For the hypothalamic control of the pituitary gland, you can see here that there are actually capillaries known as a portal system that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior lobe. While in the posterior lobe, on the other hand, you can see here kind of like nervous tissue, so they're nervous cells, and these cells end inside of the posterior lobe. So the hormones that are released by the posterior lobe are actually really made in the hypothalamus and stored here in the posterior lobe until they are needed and released into the circulation. So here you can see a little diagram showing the control of the hypothalamus over the pituitary, anterior pituitary. So again, the hypothalamus is going to make what are known as releasing hormones. These releasing hormones stimulate, so all of these green arrows are stimulations and the pluses. So the releasing hormone will stimulate the anterior pituitary. Now that anterior pituitary is going to make a second hormone, for example, TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. By the name, it'll stimulate the peripheral endocrine gland. In this example, that would be your thyroid gland. Now the thyroid gland is stimulated to make its hormone, or hormone number 3 in this case, and that would be thyroxine. When thyroxine comes out, that is going to inhibit both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. And you can see here that the TSH that comes out of the anterior pituitary is going to inhibit also the hypothalamus. So each gland really inhibits the gland or glands above it. And that is the negative feedback of this whole hypothalamic pituitary system. The anterior pituitary hormones, we've got growth hormone, prolactin, TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH. These are all released in response to hormones that are coming out of the hypothalamus. So as you can see here, this bar on the top represents the hypothalamus. This bar on the bottom represents the anterior pituitary. And down here you can see different glands or different tissue. So we'll talk first about the hormones coming from the hypothalamus, for example, growth hormone, releasing hormone, and somatostatin. So these both affect the amount of growth hormone coming out of the anterior pituitary. You can see this GHRH that is obviously going to stimulate growth hormone, and you can see somatostatin. Somato means body, or soma means body, statin means to stabilize it or to stop growth. So you can see it is going to inhibit growth hormone, and then growth hormone comes out of the anterior pituitary and affects all of these tissues. So it'll increase the growth of bones. So it'll obviously stimulate the osteocytes and stimulate osteoblasts to make more bone tissue. It'll also go to the muscle and increase the amount of muscle protein and muscle mass. It also has an effect on adipose tissue, where it increases the amount and size of the adipose cells. Moving on to the next hormone coming out of the anterior pituitary, and that is prolactin. We also have two different hormones coming from the hypothalamus that control it. We have prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone. Prolactin then throughout the bloodstream will circulate to go to the mammary glands, and that will increase or prepare the breast tissue for lactation. Next hormone is TSH. That is stimulated by TRH coming from the hypothalamus. Again, stimulates the anterior pituitary to make TSH. That'll go through the bloodstream to the thyroid gland to make thyroxine. Next hormone from anterior pituitary is ACTH, and that is stimulated by CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. Now that ACTH is going to reach the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of hormones from that. The next two hormones, LH and FSH, those are under the control of gonadotropin releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, and as you can see, they go either to the ovary or the testis in order to, the ovary is going to release estrogen and progesterone, while the testis will release testosterone. As you can see here, all of these have the hormones that we kind of continuously need. They only have releasing hormones. These hormones, growth hormone and prolactin, we really don't need it throughout our life. Growth hormone, we usually need it, when we're growing. Prolactin, we need it around lactation. So these are really controlled by releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones. But if you've noticed, the TSH, the ACTH, LH, and FSH, which we kind of need throughout most of our lifespan, those are only controlled by releasing hormones. There are no inhibitory hormones that control them. So here's a breakdown of all of these different hormones. You can go ahead and take a look at it. So first off, the control of TSH secretion, and we kind of already touched upon this a couple of times already. So again, from the hypothalamus, you have TRH that stimulates the anterior pituitary to make TSH. That through the bloodstream is going to reach the thyroid gland to make thyroxine, and then thyroxine will reach through the bloodstream, will reach all of the tissues in the body, and by negative inhibition, it will inhibit both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus from making more of their own hormones. Now for the hormones of the posterior pituitary gland, remember again, these hormones are really made by the neurons in the hypothalamus, but they are just stored and released by the posterior pituitary. They reach the posterior pituitary through the pituitary stalk or the infundibulum, and those are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So antidiuretic hormone is kind of telling you what it does for a living. It is antidiuretic, so it decreases the amount of urine you're making. It concentrates the urine, and also causes vasoconstriction in order to increase blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone, the old name for it is vasopressin, which means to press the blood vessels, to vasoconstrict the blood vessels. And from its action, that hormone is usually released if somebody is dehydrated or loses huge amounts of blood. The next hormone, or oxytocin, that leads to muscle contraction during childbirth. It also contracts the smooth muscles in the breast tissue in order to eject the milk during lactation. The function of it is not really known yet in males. It is said that it might have some kind of relationship leading to the bonding between dad and baby, but so far this is still under research. Here is a table that shows all of the hormones of the pituitary gland, the anterior and the posterior pituitary, the action and the control of these different hormones. Next hormone to talk about is the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland has these little two lobes, and then there's an isthmus, or kind of a connection between them. It looks like a butterfly, as you can see, and kind of hugs the upper part of the trachea. It is found right underneath the larynx. Don't confuse it with the thymus gland. The thymus gland kind of has a very similar name. The thymus gland, though, is down here in the chest, behind the manubrium, behind the sternum, while the thyroid gland is found up here, up in the neck, underneath the larynx. The thyroid gland makes 3 different kinds of hormones. 2 of them are thyroxine, so there is T3 and T4, and it also makes calcitonin. Okay, the follicular cells make the T3 and T4, while the extrafollicular cells make calcitonin. Here you can see these follicular cells that make your T3 and T4. You can also see the extrafollicular cells in between, and that is going to make calcitonin. Calcitonin is responsible for toning down the amount of calcium in blood, so it'll take any excess calcium from the bloodstream and deposit it into bones. Well, you can see here that pink structure right in the middle, that is colloid, which is basically concentrated thyroxine. Here you can see kind of the chemical composition of T3 and T4. T3 comes from the fact that it has 3 iodine molecules, while T4, as you can see here, has 4 iodine molecules. The actions of T3 and T4 are kind of similar, except for T3 is much more potent than T4 is. So they are both going to increase metabolism of the body. They are both going to lead to increase the rate of protein synthesis, and it's also going to lead to the breakdown of fat cells. So thyroxine, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, was an over-the-counter thing for weight loss. It has since been taken off the shelf for safety reasons, obviously. But you can always think of T3 and T4 as like the best hormone for weight loss because it'll break down fat cells, it increases your metabolism, and it increases the rate of protein synthesis. We've already talked about the action of calcitonin. So moving on to the parathyroid glands. And those are 4 glands, 2 on each side, and they're found on the back. They're stuck to the back of the thyroid gland. And they release one hormone known as parathyroid hormone or parathormone, and that regulates the levels of calcium and phosphate concentrations in blood. Action of parathyroid hormone, really parathyroid hormone increases the amount of calcium in blood, and it gets that calcium from either increasing the amount of calcium that is absorbed by the intestine, or it increases the amount of calcium that is absorbed by the kidneys, or it takes that calcium from the bone and releases it into the bloodstream. So here you can see again the effect of parathyroid hormone. So these are your parathyroid glands. Parathyroid hormone is released into the bloodstream, reaches the bone, and it releases calcium. It goes to the kidneys, and it will keep calcium in the bloodstream. So it'll increase what is known as calcium reabsorption of in the kidneys. It'll also lead to the activation of vitamin D. And then parathormone also goes to the intestines and increases the absorption of calcium in the intestines. So you see that all 3 of these are going to increase the amount of calcium in blood, and that will inhibit, through negative inhibition, negative feedback will inhibit the glands from releasing more hormone. The adrenal glands or the suprarenal glands, these are found right on top of the kidney. It's made out of a cortex and a medulla. And you can see here the different layers. So there is a zona glomerulosa on top, and a zona fasciculata in the middle, and a zona reticularis underneath. So all 3 of these zones make the cortex. And then you have the medulla that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. For the effect of epinephrine and norepinephrine, they both kind of have the same effects, just with very mild differences. They both increase your heart rate. They are both released due to stressful conditions, in acute stress in particular. So too much epinephrine can lead to tachycardia, can lead to increase in blood pressure, increase in the rate of breathing, increase in metabolism. And you can see that the adrenal medulla really releases about 80% epinephrine and 20% norepinephrine. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are synonymous names, but they are more of an older names. The hormones of the adrenal cortex, we've got aldosterone, cortisol, and adrenal androgens. And adrenal androgen are the male sex hormones. But in both male and female, the adrenal cortex makes androgens. So both male or females have androgens because they are made by the adrenal cortex. If we take a look at aldosterone, aldosterone really regulates the amount of sodium and potassium in our bloodstream. So it'll excrete potassium ions in the urine, but it'll keep sodium ions. Cortisol, on the other hand, decreases your protein synthesis. It increases how much fatty acids that are being released by your cells. It stimulates glucose synthesis. So you can see too much cortisol can lead to, for example, diabetes because of the stimulation of glucose synthesis. It can lead to breakdown of tissue, muscle tissue, because of the decrease in protein synthesis. So too much cortisol from chronic stress is not a good thing. So here are your the hormones of the adrenal cortex. From the zona glomerulosa, and that is the outer zone, that releases aldosterone. The zona fasciculata, or the middle zone, that releases cortisol and glucocorticoids, while the zona reticularis releases the adrenal, the male sex hormones. So we really think about it kind of like the zona glomerulosa is the one that regulates salt, the zona fasciculata is the one that regulates sugar through cortisol, and the zona reticularis regulates sex through the male sex hormones that are being made. Now the renin-angiotensin system, that is a system that helps maintaining the normal blood pressure, and the product of that whole system, or angiotensin 2, increases the blood pressure and promotes the secretion of more aldosterone. Okay, and as we said, aldosterone conserves sodium, so it keeps sodium in the bloodstream, and it dumps the P in the pee, so it dumps the potassium in the urine. So you can see here so angiotensinogen is a protein that is normally circulating in the bloodstream. When the blood pressure decreases, that will lead to activation of angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, okay, through renin, and that renin comes from the kidney. And then angiotensin 1 will be activated into angiotensin 2 through what is known as an ACE enzyme, or angiotensin converting enzyme, and that occurs in the lungs. Now that angiotensin 2 is going to do a couple of things. So it is going to increase the amount of aldosterone released in the system, and it is also going to lead to vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. Both of these actions will lead to hopefully increasing the blood pressure back to normal. Regulation of the cortisol secretion. So again, hypothalamus is really regulated by higher brain centers. So for example, if we're stressed, that stress is going to send, the stress part of the brain is going to send signals to the hypothalamus to make more CRH. CRH reaches the anterior pituitary stimulating it to make ACTH. And then ACTH will go to the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex will make cortisol. Now, like we said, cortisol inhibits protein synthesis, promotes the release of fatty acids, and stimulates glucose formation. So it can get you diabetic, it can make you hypertensive, lose of body mass, protein mass. So chronic stress is definitely not a good thing. The pancreas has two major functions. There is an endocrine and an exocrine function. The exocrine function, those are the digestive enzymes that are released through the duct. Okay, so the exocrine function, that releases the digestive enzymes that are needed in the intestine in order to help in digesting food, and those are released through a duct. The endocrine function, and that's the one that we're concerned about or talking about in this chapter, that will release the hormones into the blood system. So 3 hormones that come out of the pancreas. Those, all of these cells are gathered in what are known as islets, and these islets, or little islands, are known as the islets of Langerhans. The alpha cells make glucagon, beta cells make insulin, and the delta cells make somatostatin. So if you look at the function of glucagon and insulin, they are basically the opposite of each other. So insulin is going to decrease the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. It'll take that glucose and put it inside of the cell. It'll take glucose and start storing it as glycogen in the liver and in muscle. It will also take glucose and start promoting changing that glucose into protein and fat and any other chemicals that are needed. So your end result would be a decrease in the level of blood glucose. Well, glucagon is the opposite. Glucagon increases the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, so it'll lead to the breakdown of glycogen, releasing glucose into your bloodstream, and it can also lead to the breakdown of fat, releasing, fat can be converted into glucose as well. While somatostatin, without going into details, it just helps regulate the levels of carbs in the blood. Here you can see if, kind of a regulation of blood glucose levels. So if the blood glucose level is in normal range, we're good. If it gets too high, that will stimulate the receptors in the pancreas. So the beta cells are going to release insulin. Insulin then will lead to its effect, all the actions that we just talked about, and that will decrease the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, so back down to normal. While if the blood glucose levels go down too low, that will stimulate the alpha cells of the pancreas to release glucagon, and glucagon is going to break down glycogen found in the liver and muscle, releasing all of that glucose into your bloodstream, bringing back the blood glucose levels back to normal. So stress and its effects. As you can see, the adrenal gland makes two different stress hormones. There's a hormone that comes out of during acute stress, like norepinephrine and epinephrine, and there's another hormone that comes out during chronic stress, for example, cortisol. So an example of acute stress would be an exam, okay? So you have an exam or an interview. That is something that'll, is acute. It happens for a short period of time. It's not something that happens every day. But if you're going through, or somebody is going through a very hard period, like maybe death of a loved one or divorce, with something more of a chronic nature, something that takes weeks and months and maybe even years to go through, that is a source of chronic stress, and that'll release cortisol in the bloodstream. So these different stressors, anything that causes a stress is known as a stressor, and all of these stresses or stressors have different effects on the body. So there's, like I said, acute stress can lead to increase of adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine, leading to tachycardia, high blood pressure, while chronic stress releases cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and that can lead to diabetes, hypertension, and other physical conditions. Different kinds of stresses that we go through, we've got psychological stress. As you can see here, danger, personal loss, anger, fear, and guilt. Physical stress means exercise, for example. That is an example of physical stress. So like we said, the hypothalamus controls our response to stress. So there's a general adaptation or general stress syndrome where there is an alarm stage or an acute stage, and that would lead to the epinephrine and norepinephrine release. These are usually temporary, so there's an increase in heart rate, a temporary increase in blood pressure, increase in your breathing rate, kind of shunting of all the blood to the skeletal muscles to help with that stress in that, stressful condition. Okay, there is also the resistance stage, and that is when you've got long-term stress, and that really leads to the release of cortisol, mainly cortisol, okay, and that leads to all of the side effects of your prolonged exposure to cortisol, for example, becoming diabetic and hypertensive. So here this is a diagram that shows that. So you've got all of the stressors that are affecting the hypothalamus. If it is an acute stress, something short term, so it'll stimulate the adrenal medulla to make epinephrine and norepinephrine, leading to this short-term flight or fright situation with these temporary changes in the body. While if you got the adrenal cortex stimulated by chronic stressors, that can lead more to long-term effects on the body. These are just kind of like in writing or in a table, the major events that happen in the general stress syndrome. We kind of already talked about all of them. And that finalizes the review of Chapter 13.